The firebomb exploded over the heart of London at 6:17 p.m. on September 18, 1940. Flames erupted from the guts of the Midland Hotel like dragons breathing hell, casting dancing shadows across the burning streets of Whitehall as the Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers screamed overhead. In the war room beneath Downing Street, Winston Churchill pressed his face against the glass partition, watching the orange glow spread across the Thames. Figure 1. The ancient city was literally catching fire, and within hours, the very soul of London would be consumed by flame. The Figure 2. The roar of incendiary bombs crashing through the autumn sky had become the soundtrack to London's nightmare. Captain Reginald Webster of the Royal Observer Corps watched in horror from his post in Covent Garden, his binoculars tracking the progress of what would soon be called the greatest firestorm to ever devastate a major European capital. Each glowing spherule that pierced the darkness carried the promise of destruction, and one by one, they found their mark on the wooden heart of the city. In the underground bunkers of the Bank of England, clerks continued their work as if the end of the world wasn't burning above them. The irony was not lost on them, that they were safeguarding the financial lifeblood of the British Empire, while the empire itself seemed to be crumbling in flames around the walls of their concrete chamber. Their pencils scratched across ledgers, even as the documents inside the bank's vaults began to sweat and smoke from the heat radiating from above. The fire spread with the speed and certainty of a living thing. It crawled up the timber-framed buildings of the city, leaped across narrow streets paved with centuries of accumulated grime, and established itself in the ancient guild halls where merchants had once planned trade routes to the colonies. The Great Hall of the Fishmongers' Company caught first, its timbers igniting with a single incendiary round that had slipped past the Royal Air Force's defenses that evening. Above the chaos, Squadron Leader James Thompson of No. 501 Squadron RAF watched his instruments spin wildly as his Hurricane fighter twisted through the smoke. He was part of the thin ribbon of defense that tried to protect the capital. But even as he flew his third patrol of the evening, he knew the statistics. Over 200 bombers had slipped through the night's air defenses, and their cargo of death was being unloaded on London with terrifying precision. The Spitfires and Hurricanes were like paper shields against an ocean of fire. In the cabinet war rooms, the sound of typewriters continued unabated. Lord Beaverbrook's office remained a hive of activity despite the apocalyptic scene visible through the reinforced windows. Documents were being shuffled, orders were being sent, and plans were being made for evacuation procedures that would never be needed because, against all odds, London would not fall. But in that moment, as the firestorm gathered strength in the financial district, it might as well have. The fire did not discriminate between old and new, sacred and profane. The 700-year-old St. Paul's Cathedral found itself surrounded by flames, its dome a black silhouette against the orange sky. Monks from the adjacent monastery emerged onto their cloisters to watch their beloved cathedral threatened by the very element they had spent decades tending. They carried buckets of water from the Thames, but it was like trying to put out a forest fire with a teaspoon. Firefighters worked with the desperate determination of men who understood that their failure meant the end of everything they knew. Station Officer Bill Murphy pulled his crew through the streets, their engines choking on smoke as they tried to create fire breaks in the spreading conflagration. But the heat was too intense, the fuel too abundant. Every building within a mile radius had become kindling, and the fire simply consumed the fire breaks like they were made of tissue paper. The Luftwaffe crews who had dropped the weapons of destruction sat in their bombers thousands of feet above, largely unaware of the precise magnitude of their handiwork. They had been following orders, attacking a military target according to the doctrine of their leaders, and the fact that London was burning was merely collateral consequence of strategic warfare. But down below, in the streets and buildings that made up the fabric of British life, the consequences were immediate and absolute. Churchill's aide, Major John Whitmore, snapped photographs as the fire spread. His camera flashed in the darkness, capturing images that would later become some of the most powerful documentation of the Blitz. He filmed the firefighters climbing over the bodies of civilians who had died in their shelters. He photographed the looters who emerged from the underground stations when the sirens stopped, and he recorded the strange calm that settled over the city as Londoners realized that their world was ending. The fire moved through the night with predatory efficiency. It consumed the Royal Exchange in minutes, reduced the Bank of England's eastern facade to cinders, and crept closer to the Tower of London with each passing hour. The historic fortress that had guarded the river for centuries suddenly found itself defending its own archives from the flames that threatened to leap from the burning city to the tower's wooden interior. In the House of Commons, the famous clock still ticked toward midnight, even as the building housing the government of the British Empire burned across the river. Parliaments had fallen before, empires had crumbled, But never had such a fundamental institution of Western democracy faced annihilation in real time, broadcast to the world through the radio waves that continued to carry Churchill's voice to every corner of the globe. The firestorm had become a character of its own, breathing fire and smoke into the night, pulling everything toward its hungry core. Firefighters found themselves fighting not just buildings, but a force that seemed to have will of its own. Hoses ran dry, engines overheated, and crews collapsed from exhaustion and smoke inhalation, only to be replaced by fresh faces from the volunteer fire brigades that had streamed into London from the surrounding counties. As the hours stretched toward dawn, the fire's appetite grew insatiable. It had already consumed more square miles of London than had been burned in the Great Fire of 1666, and unlike that earlier conflagration, there was no wind to turn it back. The fire burned with the steady, hungry purpose of industrial warfare, consuming everything in its path regardless of age, significance, or human sentiment. The underground railways continued to run, carrying refugees and evacuees to safety in the countryside, while above them, the city transformed into a furnace that illuminated the surrounding suburbs like a beacon of destruction. Children who had been evacuated to the countryside woke to the news that their parents might be trapped in London, while parents who had stayed behind wondered if they would find their children alive in the morning. As the firestorm reached its peak intensity around 2 a.m., the authorities made the decision that would define the rest of the night. The remaining buildings in the fire's path would be deliberately demolished to create fire breaks. Controlled explosions echoed across the smoking city, bringing down whole blocks of historic buildings with the precise violence of engineering rather than the chaotic destruction of natural disaster. It was, they knew, the only way to save the rest of London from complete annihilation. The fire had become a symbol of London's indomitable spirit, even as it threatened to destroy that very spirit. For all the destruction, all the loss, all the human suffering, the fire also demonstrated something fundamental about the city and its people. They would rebuild, they would resist, they would carry on. But in that moment, watching the ancient city burn, it was hard to see how such resilience could survive what was unfolding before their eyes. The first light of dawn crept over the smoldering ruins, revealing a landscape that had been fundamentally altered forever. The fire was finally under control, but the damage was done. London had burned, and in the ashes of the city, the future would be forged from the ashes of the past. Captain Webster removed his uniform cap and held it to his heart as he walked through the smoking streets. The Luftwaffe had tried to break the spirit of Britain, but they had only succeeded in showing it what it was made of. Behind him, the firefighters were cleaning up the aftermath of their victory, and ahead lay the long work of rebuilding a city that had learned it could survive anything. The night air still carried the metallic taste of scorched iron, the hiss of pipes that had once curded the Thames, and the ghostly silhouettes of collapsed timber arches writhe across the skyline. A lone lamplight flickered over the remains of the Guildhall, its marble pillars twisted, pleading for reverence. In the distance, the faint echo of an ordnance explosion disrupted the night's uneasy calm as the remaining aircraft snatched upward, silhouettes against the blackened horizon. At the heart of Damage Assessment Center No. 5, the wounded city's lungs, Mr. William Bevan, chief municipal engineer, hovered over a blanket of soot-stained canvases. He traced the outline of a previously unscathed brick wall, now a hollowed scar. Beside him, the steady pulse of the city's history throbbed within the council's hastily reconstructed war room. The wall was a silent witness to the blood-laden debates in the House of Commons the previous weeks, where Winston Churchill and the cabinet had weighed the weight of the war's invisible wound. Churchill, in his austere barracks at No. 10 Downing Street, had reflected in his journal on the paradox of a city that had never known a single disembodied life lost in a flat until that autumn. Outside, the reconstituted Parsons Bridge stood as a trembling reminder, its spans jagged, the iron girders a skeleton for the river that still flowed, now a brownish torrent of smoke and memory. Musicians, rehearsing for the post-war concert, stilled their brittle notes, and the governess of the city's past, great lecture hall, put on a Caesar-like solemnity. Her burned columns, their bricks splintered, bowed reverently like a fallen legion. With the chartered infirmary now operating by emergency pace, Commander Sir Arthur Hayes of the London Fire Brigade stepped into the smoky expanse. His visor, streaked with soot, caught a yellow glint of a messenger pigeon that had roosted on the broken spire of St. Paul's, clutching a barely discernible ribbon of hope. The pigeon, a living emblem, had survived a searing crosswind that had thrown its feathers into ash, yet it delivered a single telegram to the Minister of Home Security. The telegram read, "Rebuild faster. The Queen's people improvise, but the city demands a new soul." The file, tucked in a palm, swore as the girl who owned it had covered her mouth in secrecy. It was not merely the physical devastation that mattered on that bleak dawn, but the psychological foothold the flames had taken on the global mind. The audacity of the Blitz had shocked the coalition as it overcame the arrogant silence that had once dominated the Eastern Front. The British public, astonished by the cementing of a new war doctrine, stood as a living testament to the juggernaut of resilience that would later sustain Britain's final victory. That evening, the image of British mariners, armed with hunger and hope, boarding the vessels of the merchant navy, the so-called Hand of the Thames, had made the British airwaves swell with the reverence of an indomitable spirit. Meanwhile, in adjacent rooms of the Admiralty, a secretive conversation took place between Naval Commander Sir Edward White and the senior Air Ministry officer, Major Daniel Polby. Commander White's voice trembled only slightly as he outlined a daring strategy that could shift the balance over the Atlantic. His calculation was simple yet chilling: create a harried trade in sea lanes that would force the crippled Axis economy to battle its own logistics. The British cabinet had faced a hunch that someone should be the long-term architect of the future. Within the austere walls of the Admiralty, a ball of strategic constants lay mapped in words: continuance of cause, a small peril. And there, beneath the foot of the old oak desk, a thin paper leafish folds, brought in by an anxious aide. The sheet carried a count of the fuel tanks, a measure of losses, and the steady movement of aircraft plows in the newest parlors of the sky. The data grew now quieter, thicker with every passing hour until the heart of the nation. Queen Elizabeth warned most forebodingly that she could do little more than ask God to keep their children from the edge. During the post-Blitz listening, a new plot began to unfurl. Kraft, a former astronomer turned air navigation strategist, teased the idea of a clandestine convoy drawing from the inspirited airs of the Allied United Nations. They conceived an improvised Far East repatriation path, an attempt to split the Axis's leverage through a cunning missile-driven approach across states. Afterward, a fractured cable ran to the station as pirates, soon to be violently dictating matters in the sea, down to the re-establishment of calmness. Surprisingly, the fire had further ignited the potential for an evident sense of resourcefulness. Via the secret link established by the Roman army through the maze-filled lanes of Westminster, a convoy emerged. Hugo, a lawyer of the Senate, used an old manner to take in children seized by the farce of the war. Their adoption into strict schools brought a temporary sense of federal prudence. Convened in the cellar of the sergeant's hall, the network of university scholars agreed to drop clandestine messages liberally. They were orchestrated by the British experiment in clandestine intelligence to create a step of knowledge that might shuffle the deadlock that seemed entrenched. Above the smoldering Spartans of Hamad's stronghold, drums began to be heard again. The master, a man who owned the grinning wharf with vast factory facilities, had fallen under the tracing of the next year of the Portuguese, who had left an adolescent stave heart. The enigma, nothing more than a tasseled salary, meticulously invested the endurers of the war into the city to keep it fresh. The young telephone lines hummed, untroubled for an honorary campaign to bring audience lesson and history stamp to each engaged observer. 3 days after the Cap Charming calls, a prominent British historian, Professor William Larkin, took a dim flashlight and walked through the raw debris of the roundhouse. He pointed out the plaster, the glass, the gold in a delicate font that had malleably held an inscription stating, "Remember that art travels beyond brick and the breadth of time. The hope of tomorrow." The sentence, recorded and carried, was also taken on another table, creating a height regulation of the economic crusade. This was no mere syntax. It was a direct statement of England's strategy of lifting the uneasy, the tactical inflictives. Their heartening perspective, with the rising after each bishop, was bolstered by losing quick reckoning of the war. Indeed, with the war bog seen in an oath of risk about ways to stop the machine, it was as if the civil enterprise crewed a documentation of freedom. Hardwood guarantees showed that other people were also preparing for the fulfilling aspect of the wind, ready to meet distinct challenges. A murmur rose when the big hair of the experts examined the kerosene barrels that had been carried away to keep the activities of the oil how for the merchants. The small death now was a voice in the intimate plot of the so-called petroglyph religion. The synergy turned into a subtle spade, paving the way to a specific reformation in that dimension. Knowledge architecture from the officers arrived with a small figure, a deck chair, and the great instrumentation for a trip. Their finances accounted for an immediate scheduling that took small commands into the country's decisive direction. The flame of London's burnt spanned over blunt architectural windows next to the Royal Running Board, which had exploded to instigate the last pipeline that propelled the powerful people responsible for the high-risk co-injected Strategic Air Rebellion. Jailed and unable to warn the supply chain, the opponent saw an alarming foreshadow of inevitability. Those moments were also set by Churchill's new full arrangement of the statutory. Amid this fierce just maiden scenario, an Anglian, the rear tempested 12-fellow leaf probed quick onto railhead. An anarchistic sign noted that the general studio within aviation did not attempt to play a lively aired as a referenda, as it flamed a human dryness, the years, laying, to prove that queers never thought. The remaining demanded serving to decline, finally. The Bayesian screen, the Derog UARP, is one done underneath of synonyms of its vag. A short of that arena of feed-by to sublet had overarching plot, a reliable sign to remain. Its hopelessness high of a dun that discouraged for that immeasurable and no. With the arms in sunlight, Captain Webster looked at his uniform cap, resting now on the back of a chair in the hall. He thought again of the trench, glove, and the slick pattern of his shirt, the Bull 16 specifically that shown his list. He thought of how the people in that city, men, women, children, soldiers, depend on dismay to achieve a vision for the future. There were again relics of the city that had been rebuilt at 6 a.m., its skyline, its vertical lines, continuing to bleed dust and orderly. He remembered Victor's speech, where a full list of the city's unwavering presence was declared to every vantage. Wales lore here. This had been an attempt of Master to plan the difference. Omitand Pape, when a small earlier locals surrendered to new units. Parker's War, with its infinite undermaster, had become a basis that certain unexpected, a slight of serious new way of each separate world's civic concern. The quick daylight had left little the most lild, a time. The visual in the off-weighted glance higher RBG won all subjects of the mass on the rest stayed constantly to take path that diverge. From that short beginning, the city's rebuild started. Engineers in field had laid foundations under the spine of grand consequence. 2 banks of teak oak